So, is Russia winning in Ukraine? Well, let's consider this. Since November 2023, Russia has suffered over 615,000 casualties, plus another 50,000 deserters. And what did Russia gain? Russia gained a strip of farmland that's smaller than Los Angeles County, California. So during that same period of time, to protect these Olympic gains, Russia has lost about 3,600 main battle tanks. That's more than the entire inventory of all European NATO countries combined. Currently, Russia is burning through about 1,500 soldiers every single day just to maintain control. So, how is Russia winning back home on the homeland? Well, real inflation is probably close to 27%, though the central bank says it's only 11%. The key interest rate at the central bank is about 21% currently, and about 1 million people have fled the country. Currently, about 40% of the federal budget is going to the war and to repression. It's certainly not going to the schools or the hospitals or to the dire infrastructure in the country. None of these are signs of a resurgent superpower. In fact, they're the unmistakable signs of a regime that is in terminal decline. So for all this sacrifice, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, the economic collapse, the global isolation, what has Russia actually gained? That's the kicker. Since 2022, Russia has not expanded in Ukraine. It has lost territory. So what began as a war of conquest has turned to a very slow motion retreat, militarily, economically, and morally. But how did we get here? Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet dissident and Nobel Prize winner, said that, quote, a state that does not respect the rights of its own people will not respect the rights of its neighbors. Such a state becomes a danger to everyone. And we see that Putin's Russia is clearly that danger. Not just for Ukraine, not just for Europe, but to itself. Incredibly, Vladimir Putin, who when he began the war against Ukraine said he was liberating Russian speakers, amongst other lies, has become the single greatest threat to Russian speakers anywhere on the earth. No one, not NATO, not Ukraine, has killed more Russian speakers in the 21st century than Putin. In fact, in all of history, Putin ranks second to Stalin in the number of Russian speakers that he has killed or maimed. My name is JJSmart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I've spent 2 decades studying authoritarian regimes, including the Putin regime, which banned me for life in 2010 for being a threat to the state's security. So, today I'll show you through hard data and historical parallels exactly why it is that the Putin regime won't survive. It will collapse, and it's tumbling down the road in that direction. So, right before we begin, please like and subscribe. Doing so helps me get my message out to more people about the truth about the Putin regime. Thank you. So let's look at the numbers. In 2024, Russia spent $149 billion on its military, which is a 38% jump. But the really intriguing statistic, that's 7.1% of its GDP, the highest amount since 1979 during the Soviet-Afghan War. And history tells us something about that. No regime has burnt through more than 7% of its GDP and lasted for very long. Countries throughout history, whether it was the Germans, the Soviet Union, it was Yugoslavia under Milosevic, decided to spend huge amounts on their military. In the end, it was not sustainable. In the end, getting involved in wars in foreign countries or with their neighbors didn't work out well for them. It was a bad idea. Over-militarization leads to economic strain, it leads to isolation, and eventually it will lead to collapse. And today, over 35% of Russia's industrial output is war-related, whether it's the tanks, the drones, the small arms. But even the war machine is on shaky grounds. In fact, a 2023 report from Moscow's Higher School of Economics said so. It said that 70% of Russia's tech is still import-dependent. So despite what Putin says, This is not autarky. It's strategic dependency disguised as self-reliance. And that's why when we take an example, let's say the drones, which Russia always brags about as being a great technological success, it ignores the fact that the drones were actually designed by Iranians in Iran. But Russia, who today claims that it produces about 100 Shahed drones, doesn't like to admit the fact that 82% of their parts are imported. Or that between March and May 2025, out of the nearly 8,000 drones sent to attack Ukraine, only 12.5% hit their targets. And it wasn't modern technology that took down most of the drones. Quite often, what takes down the drones are Cold War era anti-aircraft guns. So how much does Russia lose every time it loses a drone? It loses about $50,000 for something that on average stays in the air about 15 minutes. This is not innovation. It's economic self-sabotage, burning billions of dollars for battlefield illusions. But the illusions are, in fact, the greatest vulnerability. It's not just the balance sheet of what we see in the battlefield. The greatest vulnerability of the Putin regime is psychological. It's internal. Because the Putin regime doesn't just manufacture lies, it also believes its own lies. So as Václav Havel warned, the lie becomes the pillar of the system until even its authors live inside of it. And Putin lives in a delusion of invincibility. Why doesn't he want to negotiate with the United States? Why doesn't he want to sit down at the table? Putin believes lies. He truly believes that his country is doing great. People around him restrict the flow of information, which allows them to maintain their power and their influence, and thereby he makes very bad decisions, including continuing to prosecute a war that is bankrupting his nation and is destroying his military. But externally, we see other signs, clear signs, that Vladimir Putin is not invincible. That forever, that illusion, that myth was shattered. And I can tell you the specific day that it occurred is on June 23rd, 2023, when 25,000 Wagner fighters, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, seized the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. During that period of time, as you recall, they shot down a Russian aircraft and they marched within 200 kilometers of Moscow. And why this was such a historic event was not just the fact that there was a mutiny, which is a big deal. It was because it was the collapse of fear. It demonstrated that nobody came out to support Putin. The Russian National Guard didn't stop Prigozhin's people. The Russian military didn't stop Prigozhin's people. The Russian police didn't stop Prigozhin's people. Senior leadership of the Russian military, when they met with Prigozhin, drank coffee with him on the street. There's videos of it. And they said, you really shouldn't do this. This isn't a good idea. Come on, it's not the right thing to do. They certainly did not call in an airstrike on Prigozhin, though they saw him coming. They knew where he was hours in advance. They did nothing to stop him. Not the Chechens, not the Air Force, not the Army. It's because they weren't sure if perhaps Prigozhin would succeed and Prigozhin would take power and replace Putin. So, are you going to really go after the guy who might be your new boss? Probably not. But there's something else very important about Prigozhin that we do not often talk about. Prigozhin had been saying for the weeks leading up to this, and it's something that's very much so in the consciousness of the Russian public. Prigozhin had said that the Kremlin didn't care about its soldiers, and it was using them as meat. So he was complaining that this was not just a military problem, but a moral one. That there is so much corruption in the senior leadership of the Russian military and defense that the Russian soldiers were suffering as a result. He was accusing the Putin regime, though he didn't talk about Putin directly, he did talk about everyone around him who's on TV 7 days a week, as being morally vacant, as not serving the interests of their own people, of their own soldiers who are dying needlessly in a war. So this moral emptiness is something that Yuri Bezmenov talked about. Yuri Bezmenov was a Soviet defector, and he gave a wide number of interviews, which you can find on YouTube, where he says, amongst other things, that a KGB state collapses not from war, but from within, due to moral implosion. And I think if we look at what's happening today in Russia, if you're a Russian, you would see moral implosion. And we see that Russians are not happy by the way that things are going. Just in the recent weeks, over 2 million Russians, 7% of the workforce, have defaulted on their credit card debts. Apartments near the Ukrainian border in Belgorod, which is a major city, have decreased 32% in value. These people aren't really convinced that the Russian government can maintain control, sovereignty over its own territory. They're afraid that the Ukrainians might invade Russia and take the land. Since the war began, despite decades of the Russian government spending money to increase the birth rate, because it's so drastically bad currently, the birth rate has actually dropped another 13% since the invasion began. None of these things are fluctuations. They're terminal symptoms. Want to hear something incredible? Putin, during his quarter of a century ruling Russia, chose not to build a nation. We see that. He robbed the nation of its wealth, he stole its future, he crushed the society. But Putin, like the despots before him, will soon learn a hard truth, which is that you can ban the books, you can jail the reporters, you can bomb the cities, but ultimately you can't arrest the inflation. You can't bomb your way to economic growth. No matter how many people you kill, it will not make you legitimate. And what we see in today's Russia is exactly that. So though the truth is banned and reality has been totally rewritten, it doesn't change the fact that Putin's war machine simply was not built to win. It was built to survive. But currently we see that it's neither winning nor is it surviving. But the good news, history and all the data point only in one direction, which is that Putin's regime won't quietly retire into exile. It will end, and it'll end in crisis, and it will end from within. So in the days ahead, we'll take a deep dive into how Putin's regime was built, why it was built with such significant structural problems that it will fail, and how this final dramatic chapter is likely to unfold. So if you'd want to follow that journey with me, please like and subscribe. As always, thank you, and thank you for supporting Ukraine.